It looks like we're live. And so I just want to welcome everybody. Hello to everyone tuning in or looking at this in the future after it's recorded. I'm Luis Perez Cortez. I'm one of the people that form part of the Talking About Design website, along with several others, including Melissa War and Amanda Risky, who are here today and they're around helping on different fronts. Um, Over at Talking About Design, we talk about design in its richness, we like to say, and we typically do that with more of a focus on education and educational context and issues and things like that. And today, we are joined by Amanda Latasha Armstrong, who we contacted a while ago, a few months ago, maybe even a year, maybe, when Amanda Risky met her through the Cadre Fellowship last year. And Amanda Latasha, welcome again. You are a doctoral candidate at the New Mexico State University. And your research interests include the intersection of early childhood and learning design and technology, and multicultural education. And says here that you're also an education policy research fellow with New America, and you lead user testing and youth programs on game review and design at your university's Learning Games Lab. So again, Amanda, welcome. And other than this brief intro that we sort of gave you with the bio and things like that, is there anything you want to say, like a bit more about what you do in these roles and maybe what you've been up to lately?
Sure. Thanks for the introduction, and I'm happy to be joining having this conversation. You gave a really great synthesis of my work. I know I sound like I do a lot, and I would say the main thing is that I really care about research turning into action. I care about that whether it's from a teaching perspective and how teachers use technology in their classrooms, whether it's from helping policymakers think about what does this research look like from a policy perspective, or also with designers and helping them think through what they design and also design processes. So I am very hands-on in that I get to apply the work in different contexts to make it meaningful. And so I would say that's probably the cornerstone of my work, and also trying to find ways of connecting these different parts, because to me, there's so much similarities, but between jargon and processes and all these sorts of other pieces, things can get lost. And so for me, it's important to have a way of connecting and making it relatable, so that when I'm talking about action, that I'm able to help them contextualize for what it means for them, whether it's designers, educators, or policy people, or other researchers.
That sounds like a perfect fit for the things we like to talk about here. Everything you just said, I think, lines up really well. Shows that we kind of did our homework there. So good work, everybody, all around. I think that among the many things going on in our world today, you mentioned a lot of the people that you do work with, or there are also a lot of people that help us tackle these issues. But I think the pandemic still remains a very visible issue. And if you add to this the recent social movement in regards to race and racism over the past year, and I would say, like, we've been able to see, I think in education context more specifically, a lot of the inequities that were already there, but were perhaps made even more glaring in a lot of places around education. And I know that you mentioned this earlier, and we kind of introduced you with these topics, but you work at the crossroads of like early childhood, and learning design and tech and all these things. But a big part of all that are these issues of culture and of diversity. And one question that I know I had for you was, like, in your opinion, what is one or maybe a few of the important contributions that this work, does to these issues? And, why would you say that current and future work on this needs to continue happening?
So I'll answer probably in multiple ways, but please feel free to ask me to elaborate. I think we have to tackle it in different ways, which is why I think my work sits at the intersection. So I noticed that one thing that's usually missing is that people will talk about these sorts of issues in silos. So early childhood educators will talk amongst it with early childhood educators, and ed tech folks amongst each other, designers amongst each other, policy people, research people amongst each other. And so for me, I find my work is really important. And why I really got into this work is because I wanted there to be more connection between them. And particularly right now, we're at this point where I think I'm so busy with with different projects because there is kind of this need for that. And so the work I do with New America, I'm a part of their inclusive tech team where we're talking about these sorts of issues of open resources and culturally responsive teaching. What do materials look like? Do they reflect culturally responsive pieces? Teaching practices, how is the pandemic extrapolating inequities that already exist? And so I think if you follow my work, I present work in different contexts so that it relates. So for instance, so for the pieces that I write for Edutopia, I mean, a lot of that is taking research and saying, okay, here's what this means for your classroom when you're selecting materials. Like, so not only do you have to think about making sure you're culturally responsive, but then you also now need to look at the materials you have and see if it's reflective of your communities and the learners, as well as exposing them to other kinds of communities. And then how are different people portrayed? How are different roles given? Who's seen and who aren't seen? And so really kind of asking those critical questions from a teaching perspective. From a researcher perspective, it will look like, who's included? How are you collecting data? Are you questioning existing kind of dominant narratives or ways of doing things that have typically been the approach to looking at things. So for instance, for my dissertation research, I'm looking at representation of preschool apps, and there have been several studies on that issue, but they haven't necessarily, and they've looked at children's media from a sense of, here's these websites that we usually go to that are seen as these credible sources, and this is where we're going to pull our sample size. And so what I did for my dissertation was I said, yes, and we also need to consider those publications that center the perspectives of BIPOC communities, of gender minoritized communities. And so I went and did a different approach to that. And so because of that, my dissertation process has taken longer because I have a critical lens as a researcher. But it's because I want to make sure it's looking at culture, looking at these issues of inequities, whose voices are seen and whose voices aren't heard. And so I think what my work does is it contextualizes in different parts, and depending on how you meet me or how you interact with me, I could also talk about it from a designer perspective. We have a blog site for where I work at the Learning Games Lab on our work, and I'm just finishing up a piece on our process of centering diversity and representation in our characters and the processes that we do with that. And so I think that my work is important in that it takes them and says, okay, here's what it means in this context. And just kind of, as I was saying, depending on how you meet me, depends on what you hear and what lens you have, but I have a way of connecting them both. And I see the bigger picture. I think like that's the big part of my work is I don't see them as siloed. I see them as the bigger picture. And then in these different silos, I'm trying to help people see the bigger picture. I'm trying to help them see how, design relates to education or how research relates to design. And so they're all kind of interconnected. So for me, I feel like I'm translating a lot of things. And for me, it's interesting and be a lot of mind work, but I think it's one way of making things move forward.
I love that. That's such a designerly way of just being and interacting with the world, like customizing like what you're telling, how you communicate what you do based on the purposes, right? What the purpose of this is. And I thought it was really interesting. We were actually just talking briefly before we started this today about kind of a hot topic item of critical race theory in schools. And I thought it was really interesting that you said, look, when we talk about to teachers about what they do, here's one thing. And when I'm a researcher, I do this other thing. And I know you talked about it some. I'm curious what more you would say. Like, what do you think teachers' roles are in addressing inequities in schools? And then how do you explain like when you say you take a critical view on your research, how would you explain that? Because I think a lot of people aren't as familiar with that type of perspective.
So for the educator perspective, I think it depends on how I enter. So sometimes it's I want them to think about the kind of materials that they have. And so in order for them to think about the kind of materials they have, I have to get them to look at, and if that's reflective of the community. It has to start with like taking an inventory and noticing patterns and saying, do you notice people who are seen or who aren't seen? Is this reflective of your students? And maybe they have something that's reflective of their students. And then I may ask, do you see something that's reflective of other students? Is this authentic to people's lifestyles? And there are several different tools. Like I'm a part of a group called HitMap, and we created one for us looking at diversity and representation in interactive media. And that really pulled from a lot of things that have been done from multicultural education. So you can take it from the material standpoint. Maybe you also not only look at materials, but also think about, if there aren't materials that are reflective of the community, how can we encourage creation amongst the students? How can we encourage creation and build knowledge from the communities, from the families? Do we know, how are we integrating the families into the community? Do they feel like they belong there? Why do they and don't they? And so it's kind of, you have to take all these different pieces, but take them step by step, but then seeing, really it's about supporting everyone in the classroom community. I know I've written about that, but it's really about supporting everyone in the classroom community, not just the students, but also the families and the community itself. And also it's about being able to, as an educator, learn from the students consistently, help being a model for that. And I feel like that's so much of a design perspective, is that it's really about supporting that knowledge building and inquiry and supporting inquiry in different ways. So that's one way I would say to approach it with educators. I mean, it just kind of really depends. Sometimes there have been educators who just say, I don't even know where to start with asking questions. And sometimes I may point them to different books and resources. Like for early childhood, there's a lot of work on anti-bias education. There's a lot of work on scholars who have talked about supporting Black children in their classroom, their Black communities, and affirming their identity as well as their cultural knowledge. So I think it also depends on how the educator comes to me. And so I'm very customizable, I guess you would say. So there isn't one size that fits. It just kind of really depends on the situation. And then from a research perspective, with thinking about what does it mean to be critical, I actually struggled with that, even though I grew up in Chicago, in St. Louis and Chicago. I grew up with a family of educators. They were very much about, supporting my own identity as an African American, as well as supporting other people's identities and cultural groups and languages. And I went to an international studies school growing up, where I had friends who had come from so many different countries, people speaking different languages around me all the time. So I was immersed in this environment where I thought it was the norm to have diversity, and diversity seen as an asset. I didn't come from a deficient perspective. So it's hard for me to really understand what critical was when I was kind of in it. And so when I went and did my dissertation, and actually one of the reasons I came to New Mexico State is because they focus on critical pedagogies. They focus on multicultural education in their college of education. That's such a big centering piece of them. And so for them, it really was about starting with understanding our own identities and our own privileges. So even though I am a Black woman, I'm able-bodied, I'm still have heteronormative, I'm still cisgender, and like all these different parts of me that I'm both experiencing oppression, and then I'm also can oppress other people. And so it's that mindfulness of awareness of the self, and then understanding that things are socially constructed, and that there are certain groups who have gotten to say, this is the way we should approach research, and this is the way we should approach education. But it's seen as the norm, rather than, it does make it easier for some people to enter in educational spaces or enter into research, because it already builds on something that they're used to doing in their day-to-day life and how they approach things. So they're affirmed in that whereas some of us may not feel as affirmed. Like for me, it was really hard for me to articulate being really critical of the media because it wasn't embraced in all educational spaces and all design and research spaces to be so critical that I'm not only just looking at who's represented, how people are represented. I was the person checking out media, documentaries about the representation of various racial and gender and identity groups for fun. So for me, I also thought, aren't we all doing this because we're, talking about media? But I realized that other people weren't. And so I felt uncomfortable in voicing that and being really critical of what I'm seeing. And really, to me, critical is asking questions consistently and being amongst a group of people who are always asking who's seen, who's not seen, whose knowledges are centered, whose knowledges aren't centered, whose ways of life are affirmed, whose ways of life aren't, and seeing how that happens in different situations and seeing, oh, if certain people experience this in multiple situations all the time and have seen and had that experience over a period of time, over a period of generations, then that means that then you can kind of begin to see how inequities are formed. Because to me, sometimes it's about seeing the pattern and seeing the pattern in smaller places and then seeing, okay, now let's put a totality of this pattern. How is it can we see how this pattern may be affecting some group of people over others? And some people may choose to embrace that and some people don't. But that's one approach I take.
I just have to say that is like one of the best explanations I've ever heard of critical, looking for who's seen and who's not seen and whose values, who's not, and then combining that with looking for the patterns. I think that's a really good way to help people understand and think about what we mean when we're doing research from a critical lens and where that comes from. I just want to briefly comment for people on YouTube. You're welcome to add questions to the chat and we will ask Amanda Latasha that as well if you have any burning questions. And I'm going to let Louise ask the next question here.
Yeah, you just like to remind people too that YouTube is something that we're using because we want the audience interaction as much as possible. So go ahead and type those questions in. We'll be happy to relay those. But Amanda, something you were talking about really reminded me of something I also wanted to ask you. And so I know you work, it seems you do most of your work on the younger side of children or of learners. And I have other friends who do similar kinds of work with young children, like in elementary school, for example. And they're trying to research alongside with teachers. How can we best engage children in these kinds of conversations that involve critical thinking and critically analyzing, the issues that are happening around us in current times and into the near future. And I know because of those friends as well, maybe this has happened to you too, I think you've written about this even, is that people usually tend to respond with, oh, but why are we, isn't that too much for children, especially young children? Do you still come across that often? And if you do, how do you respond to these views or to these opinions or questions?
I do. I feel like sometimes that can be addressed in a way that a person's perspective is changed if they want it to be changed. And so for me, I also have to recognize that even if it's not even just me who's saying it. I've written about this in Edutopia. I've written about there was a recent study that showed how preschoolers show intersectional bias towards Black male preschoolers. And so there have been studies that are tracking, do young children have favorable reactions or perspectives or interactions with other students based on their social identity? And so it's to me not even a point. It's not even at a point where isn't research that isn't looking at that. I look at that. I saw it in my personal life, and so then that part of that was one of the reasons why I became a researcher, because I knew it to be true based on my own experiences. Even though I think that's for me how critical lends itself to me was that I could say, oh, well, people aren't asking this question or aren't asking the question in this way. Like, how are we finding out what children prefer and don't prefer, and who are they choosing as their peer partners, who are they selecting as characters. And so like for me, because I could see the pattern happening in my own experience and happening with the next generation, I could ask those questions. And so then I could look for studies that say that, or that look at this issue and that present it. So then when there are some people who do have that, and have that resistance or have those ideas about young children not really understanding understanding difference, that social identity matters, that skin tone privileges other students, that able-bodied, that gender, like that, all these sorts of things privilege people, but they do understand. I think sometimes it's the way in which adults expect it to show up can be different, because they're not going to say, they may not call someone a word, or it's kind of like it doesn't show up the way it does with adults. And I think sometimes adults expect it to show up the way it does. And it doesn't. It could happen where they could say they don't want to play with somebody because of how they look, or because of their hair, or because of their, another sort of facial feature. So sometimes it's really noticing how children interact with others to notice that that happens. So you can notice it, you can review studies that say it. And so if people at that point aren't open to it, I do have a level of frustration, but I also know I can't necessarily make them change their mind. I can kind of just help to expose them to it, that it does exist, even if it is not acknowledged or not. So it still happens. It doesn't happen as often because there's been such a push. At the same time, as was noted earlier in this dialogue, there's been a lot of pushback on these sorts of multicultural education and critical approaches to education and design work. And so there's also has to be the acknowledgement that there is this resistance that not is just in an individual person, that's nationally, and it's kind of nationally affirmed by these different policies that's being enacted. And so for me, part of what I also try to do is show or point to research that's shown that we need positive portrayals of media characters in educational material, supports learners, engages them in the material, engages them in learning the content, whether it's literacy, science. And so I try to also point to that, to even if they're not open to understanding that children have social biases, that we still want to support all children's learning, and we still want healthy growth and development. And here's some strategies, here's some ways that we can do that. So I have various strategies, as you can tell, that I use. It just kind of depends on where the educator comes from, because I think ultimately we all want all children to have a safe and supportive learning experience. And so for me, I try to really connect with educators on that and help educators see that this is one way that we can create these supportive learning environments.
Yeah, I think a lot of what you said for a moment reminded me of even my own really early experiences with something that you wouldn't consider, these kinds of issues to pop up, did pop up. So for example, just a very quick little story about me, probably the first time I ever used something like fairy tales and analyzed them in any way that wasn't just, reading them for what they were as an entertaining story, was during my undergrad, probably my first year in my Spanish literature class, where we analyzed some fairy tales. And it was like the regular old story you've heard 1,000 times of, for example, Little Red Riding Hood. And then the professor would say, but have you noticed this or that or the other thing? We would just completely dive into an analysis of the same story, but from a whole new, different perspective, to us at least, about what we can think and talk about and see, whether it's said overtly or not, within the same text, right? And so a lot of the things that I know you worked with or have written about include using different texts, and by that I mean media, games, a number of things, text in the wider definition of it, to help kind of bring in these conversations into the dialogue, and then maybe use that as a springboard to dive into more of the things the standard things you're expected to teach and learn in schools. And so one question here, I think going back to an earlier point of critical race theory in schools recently, in recent times, being such a, I guess, controversial point. Do you think games or other media, hold any particular or general advantages or disadvantages for this, this purpose?
Because I think about it as a continuation of different forms of media. And I recently did a session with 4-H students. It's a mixture of like mid-elementary to high school students, and talking about games. And I think the other thing about media with books, and because it's not so isolated anymore, and it can cross over into dolls and, in digital forms and games. And so I think if you create space for those conversation in other forms of media, you can do it with games. I think you have to separate it differently. So it could be that you play through, maybe you just stop and you notice the character screens and the avatar and what are the options. Are there anything that's missing? Sometimes I ask students, do they feel like something from their own life is missing? Is there something they would like to add? Is there something, do they feel like their friends would feel like they could see themselves? Is there anything that they think their friends would want to add? And so it's engaging them in that conversation where you're getting them to ask questions without necessarily you saying you need to ask this or you need to be looking for this, but it's supporting that inquiry. And so I think with games and other forms of digital media, there may be a different rhythm you have to do, because like we're very versed in what it looks like with books. And I would say even for me, I'm still exploring what games and apps and other sorts of digital resources look like and educational materials. And so then I think for myself as the educator, it's on me to want to explore it and look at it and see what the device does. Maybe I look at it on my own. If I have time, maybe it's a study group or a group of other peers where we're looking at things. Because I also think the other part is that even though I explore this issue all the time, I enjoy exploring it with other colleagues and other people. And so I have so many different friends, and then they have different life experiences. They have different social identities. And so I overlook things because of, as I said before, I have certain, privileges and I have certain social identities. And there are things I really am sensitive to because of my own experiences. And then my friends have different experiences, and some of them have similar experiences, some of them don't, and so I have to even think about my own experiences as like a native English speaker in America. Like, what does that mean? And how does that show up in my own citizenship? And so those are things that I sometimes will miss, and my friends will note those sorts of things, and I'm like, oh, okay, I didn't even think about that because I didn't have, even though I have several checklists. I mean, if I'm going through something briefly and having a brief, conversation and want to look at something, I may overlook things. And so I think also as a critical person, it's important to know I don't know everything, and I still have my shortcomings or have things that I don't notice for whatever reason. It could also be because of time maybe, or I'm stressed out. Like there are so many different factors that play a role. And I also have to give someone else that grace as well. And so I think because I see my own flaws as a person, I can say, oh, if they missed something, I'm not going to be like, oh, how could you miss that they, it's more, did you all notice this? So when I was looking at this, I saw this. And so I feel like with digital media, we need more time to play and look at it and notice the affordances, because we've given so much time with television and with books and other forms of media that we need to also extend ourselves this level of grace to explore, but not be deterred because we don't know instantaneously. More use it as an opportunity to play and communicate with other people and build community and dialogue and have fun. And I think there's just this opportunity here where sometimes it can be missed because we're trying to find the right answer and the right solution, and not always saying, okay, we need to play for a minute and then be critical and analyze.
Yeah. Can I ask a question, Louise? Because this is
Yeah,
great. I really am enjoying this. And I get to be the person from a different background, because Louise and Latasha are like really experts in this literacy, text, media, game world. And I'm wondering if you could just like break it down a little bit for people who aren't used to those terms, like the relationships between when we talk about what a text is in the literacy sense and what media is and how that interacts with identity. I think that's a relationship that's really interesting. And I don't know, Latasha and Louise, like, I don't know if you could define, like, how would you define text or media and how does that interact with our identity? It's kind of a hard question, but I'm curious, how would you describe that?
Yeah, I mean, just to maybe give Amanda a little bit of a break to catch her breath a little bit. There's just to start with like the text question, right? I think in my just from my own experience, it was kind of a moment of realization, I guess, critical of sorts, where you come about and you see that the word text was very heavily associated with like printed words on a page or on paper in a book specifically. And that was like the source of when you want to learn something, that's where you go to. You go to the books. You usually sort of even see it in like the common expressions of, oh, well, you got to go and read the books or things like that. You got to hit the books hard and things like that. And when we think of almost everything else that's not that, like people outside of literacy don't tend to see them or those other things with the same value or worth, educational wise, as the book or the written page. And I guess to me, the word text can encompass pretty much like anything, to be in the most general or vaguest sense of the word, that you interact with and read and can get something from and you can use to think with or think, I guess, through. And text encompasses things like games, video games, television, media, music, web forums, things, almost anything you can think of, depending how you frame it and how you use it, right? What it's designed for and what you kind of design the experience with it for can be seen as a text. That's kind of where I come from. I wonder if Amanda has a different or
what's I'm just trying to think of how confused I've been at times about this, and I'm curious, why are we calling everything a text like that? Like, what's the advantage? Why don't we just reserve text for books? Like, what's the advantage of expanding this definition, or maybe not expanding it but using it in this other way?
Good question. I don't think I've thought about that one specifically too much, but just off the cuff, I can think of one advantage that it kind of maybe helps us think of or attach or see that value that we tend to see in books in other things as well. If we start kind of referring to them in this with the same term, I think it can help I guess boost the perception of them. That might be something that can happen, or maybe not, but that's a really good question, I think. I wonder if Amanda has any thoughts about these.
Yeah, I haven't thought about text specifically. And I say that I probably use it interchangeably because I got my bachelor's in English. And so for me, reading and text and so it's really a form of communication. And so then I think a lot about UDL principles, Universal Design for Learning, and how they talk about different forms of communication and expression and understanding. And so when I think about text, I probably default to thinking about the broader understanding of how are we presenting information and giving opportunities for different people to take in information. Because I also think that if we limit text to just what's written on the page, then that's really limiting, and it already isolates so many learners, people with varying abilities. And so I don't think of it so isolated, versus I think about what are the tools used, and maybe a different word we can use would be like tools, or like, and maybe that just is like a larger conversation for the field of, how do we use things and how do we term? Because I think so much to Luis's point that we do associate literature to certain values, and that you really don't learn something unless you read it and look at it in the textbook. And there's so many different ways that we need to think about learning, which is why I point to UDL. And even for me as an educator, I will point to UDL often and say, well, am I giving different learners opportunities to take in the information? And am I presenting it? Like, I really don't enjoy audio things. I don't enjoy recording myself, but yes, as an educator, I do need to get over myself and find some audio options. And it's really good for, even if I can get someone else to do it, if I can do it myself, I think particularly because of my social identity, I think it's good for people to hear it. For representation matters. So I know that if I'm not representing myself and I'm talking about we're not seeing different people, then different people aren't seen. And so I think I see the whole, the bigger picture and how everything's connected, because I may say, oh, I don't feel like doing this. But so I think going back to the text, I think so much of it is about how do we still maintain the integrity, as Lisa was saying, about educational experiences and learning experiences, and how do we pull people into education? Like, to me, that's what I'm interested in. I'm interested in pulling like students, whoever, designers, everyone into learning and making it meaningful for them and allowing them to take it on and take it in and contextualize it for their situation, or figure out how to express it for themselves. And so if I think about that as the larger picture, to me, text becomes about what's the best way and what's the more variety that I can offer people to give them information and to have them absorb the information. It does take a lot more thinking, though, because I'm not a lecturer when it comes to teaching. I'm more of a facilitator. That's how I like to think of myself, which takes a different level of work. It takes a different level of engagement, because it looks like you're not doing anything. It just looks like you're answering questions, but you've really been scaffolding this whole experience for the learner to take it on. But in order for learners to take it on, I think how you deliver the information, how you present opportunities for learning really does matter. And so I don't, maybe text isn't the best word in this context, but I also think that text is the way that you associate value with learning.
Yeah, I think those are both great responses. I love the UDL perspective too on that. And another thing that I would just maybe add, and this goes along with recognizing the importance of text, because I taught digital literacy some as well. And just, when we're looking at like representation, acknowledging that what we see on TV is influencing who we are. We can learn a lot outside of reading books. And I think sometimes by emphasizing that type of text, just all the media around us, it helps us recognize those other influences on our lives and all the ways that we learn that are not sitting in a classroom or reading a book.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's really good too. Yeah, and aside from that too, or in addition to that, rather, it's the fact that, we do engage with these kinds of thinking, the thinking we kind of aim or strive to do with like the traditional text in a school. We already do a lot of that in many different ways with different things. And that's, I think, part of the I guess, worth in using those other texts in these settings to help us sort of see that, you're already doing this. I, for one, was a learner who I actually, in fact, literally said to one of my professors when asked up front, do you like to read? I say, no, I don't like to read. And years later, I would find out, thinking back and reflecting, that I read a lot. I just didn't read what I thought counted as reading. I read a lot of video games, for example, and I read other things. So I loved reading. I just didn't enjoy reading books. I think that's worth it.
Yeah, it's valuing all the different ways of knowing and expressing, right? Beyond just what we normally traditionally value in school.
And I think those of us, like for me, I flourished in reading. I flourished in the traditional forms of schooling. And so I, as a person who flourished in that, also have to be critical of that. And I think as an educator, as a researcher, as the one who works with developers, I feel like I have to constantly interrogate my own self and how I'm looking at things, because I can write something and be fine. I can read something that someone wrote and be fine and completely absorb and understand it. But then I also have to think, well, who's missing? Who may not this resonate with? I think it helps to have a diversity of friends and colleagues who learn in different ways and are comfortable with saying how they absorb information differently, because that makes me sensitive to that. I think if other people only associate learning with a certain way and then only are around people who affirm that, then it becomes harder to make the argument that we're constantly absorbing information and there are different ways of taking in information. And also, I one thing I really enjoy about doing user testing in the game lab is that we bring in different kids or whoever who the audience is, and then so they test our products, and then because we're able to see how people are interacting with things, we get to see what's happening with them, how they're taking in the information, how are different people's experiences with the different forms of media. So you can kind of sit back and just absorb and observe and ask questions and really kind of take in what their experience is. And I feel like that translates really well into myself as an educator. I think like I didn't go into design thinking I was going to do user testing, but I realized that my approach to education lends itself really well to being a user tester in this particular context at the lab.
Thank you. I just want to mention one thing that's kind of happening in the YouTube chat. Punyu Mishra, he was my doctoral advisor, and he's kind of worked with all of us on Talking About Design team a little bit, kind of pointed out we have this framework that's the 5 spaces for design and education. And one of those spaces is artifacts. And so he wanted to emphasize that we have an artifact, any type of object, that is open to interpretation or meaning making. So any type of object I have, I'm going to interpret it or make meaning of it in a certain way. And so in a way, an artifact can actually become a text that has a property. And then if you follow our framework out, that can affect all the other areas that we design. But the design of that text or that artifact has a lot of power in it. And books are just one of those types of artifacts. So just wanted to bring that up from the chat. Louise, I totally sidetracked us. You had a great question coming up, and then I went off onto this text sidetrack.
I love the conversation. I'm enjoying like having the conversation and talking with, and just hearing everyone's feedback, and then bringing in everyone's personal experiences and professional lens and researcher lens, because we're looking at this, something, but from a different way, even if we're talking about it with using the same kind of design language, but even how we're interpreting design and how we look at it depends on so many different factors. I'm enjoying it.
No, hey, if I had a great question coming along, let's just pretend it's this next one. So Amanda, by the way, if there's anything else going on YouTube, by all means, make sure to bring it up as we start to wrap up in just a few more minutes. But one thing that I shared with you a couple of weeks ago was that a little snippet of data from the Entertainment Software Association. And they kind of, setting aside or not, if we don't want to, like the fact that they kind of advocate for games and the games industry and things like that, but they kind of say in their latest report that, people from all walks of life, and I'm kind of quoting right now, people from all walks of life reached for video games to find joy, connection, and a sense of belonging when it was needed the most. And they're talking about the COVID-19 pandemic there. But even their own data, like when you look at it, kind of reflects what can be interpreted as, largely unequal use, or at the very least use, but maybe even access, right, to things like video games specifically, because, they say the people they surveyed, about a third, or like 70%, are identify as white, and more than half are male. And so like I, for one, am interested in using video games specifically, but given these numbers, are they even good things to even tackle these issues of equity if we have like numbers like these that show that overwhelmingly it seems like most users are still white and male?
That's it's a layered question that I have different responses to. So, I mean, yes, the industry is as it is, as you've mentioned. I think some things that are the light kind of that I enjoy seeing in this or experiencing as a part of this community of being in the design community is that there is more conscious effort towards that. So there is this conference, Games for Change, that I was just attending, and there are these conversations happening about the industry. So I think part of it is having the data to say, these are the inequities that we're seeing in the system, and then the system being able to react to that. I mean, and so I think like that the fact that we can point to data that says that, and it's not kind of a person that's experiencing it saying, hey, I noticed I'm one of a few like Black women in the room, you know, talking about design. But being able to say that, oh, we see that this is a pattern in the system and we really need to do something about, like, what are we doing about programs that are encouraging, you know, whether it's design, whether it's game design, you know, as one specific form itself. So it's like that in itself has to be a separate, like not a separate conversation, but a part of the conversation of how are we creating these educational experiences and supporting people so that they finish these you know, education, whether it's as an artist or a designer, and move through these programs, and then how do we support them in mentorship. And it's similar to what's happening in other programs. I'm kind of a part of that in the early childhood community through Erickson, like as an alumni in early childhood, supporting other students and being like a resource for them. And so, which is its own work. I understand, like, it's not on the onus of the people who are being marginalized and have experienced inequities to always choose to do that. I think you have to make that choice. But I think, you know, being able to understand, like, there are different things in place and how can we support educational spaces. I think also having processes, having people in place to discuss what does design look like from a representation diversity perspective. As I mentioned earlier, I've finished up a piece for our lab's blog on talking about one of our processes for looking at diversity and representation, which then I was talking to our director, and then it opened up another conversation because we're working on another product right now. And so then it came up, like it came up again, obviously, but it's integrated in the process. So it was able to come up, and then we're saying, oh, maybe we should write another blog post to really talk about the integral parts of having like these uncomfortable kind of conversations, and having people, like, I think part of it is having people in the team that feel comfortable bringing up these issues. And so our team has been, you know, working towards that and have been building that, where we feel comfortable having these conversations about what if we're noticing that a certain identity group isn't seen, or we're noticing that maybe we're doing a trope or a stereotype of a specific community because we want to have a certain kind of theming, but that theming is problematic because of different things. So part of it is having, you know, the kind of space where you can advocate that, and then also having the knowledge about, well, what are the stereotypes and what are portrayals? That was one thing that even for me, because I spend a lot of my time being critical, and as I mentioned before, watching documentaries on representation, I just really thought that was just, and so like, because I have this lens, I think, oh yeah, everyone knows who, and because it's not just about my group or my community. I'm always looking at what other people are saying reflective of their communities, and not to say I'm a spokesperson, but I think it is a responsible thing for me to also be aware of what other things that other communities are problematizing. And so I think like that's another issue of people even knowing what these issues are within representation and portrayal. So I think, you know, there are so many different parts of the system that need to be addressed and that people are gradually addressing, but because this system has been as it is, as so many other systems, it takes time to do that. So I'm aware of what's happening, but for me as an action person, I say, okay, how can I take the research and do something about it? So for me, it's working on design teams and bringing up issues, it's writing about it, it's collaborating with other people and finding out what they are. It's you know, it's also being a supportive space, being a model of that by how I am, even though I don't always consider myself a gamer. I kind of ended up in the industry in a happenstance kind of way. But I'm really glad, because then I also see the fuller picture, and I not only see about design and thinking about game design, but then I also think about, well, how is this also seen in other spaces of education, and how can I support that? And also supporting design thinking in itself. I think, you know, I think part of it comes from just even understanding what that is, whatever that means within a different context, is because there are different people who have different definitions of it, but being able to understand creativity and wonder and creating something and iterating on it and that whole process. I think like even having that introduction, that early introduction, can be really supportive, so that when people are in spaces of design, they're not looking for the right answer. They're really looking to experience the process of design. So I know that was multiple parts. It's very layered, and there probably is a layer that I didn't address, but those are the ones that just stick out to me because I've been in those conversations recently.
Yeah, I think, well, something that stuck out to me from what you said was kind of essentially the last bit about not necessarily learning to think in one way, but learning how to engage with different situations, basically, which is what you were trying to get at. To me, it seemed to me, with what you were wrapping up your point. And it also reminded me of kind of the work that I'm doing, because you brought up like the keyword of design thinking. I know my work, I've used that in different ways and kind of used it to kind of quickly get across the general sense of what I'm trying to talk about. But it does mean different things to different people, and it engages or is used in different ways to engage different populations. And in my own work, and this is something that you might be a little bit familiar with, we use like board games or tabletop games to try to get young children, again, thinking about larger issues that don't stay within the game they're working with, but can get them thinking about, one, the problem, and two, like how to address it within their game world, sure, but also as a way to help them think about it. And maybe, in a sense, use that game, as we were talking about earlier, as a text to think about or think through those issues. And so what you were saying kind of reminded me of that work, and it's something that I think seems to be useful for especially the young children, the kids that actually engage with it. And it seems to me also that as more teachers who are or used to be gamers themselves, you said you maybe don't always identify as a gamer, kind of get into the profession, it strikes me that those kinds of activities might be something that's used more often, maybe even in better ways that I could think of right now, with even younger teachers now getting into the field than I am. So I was wondering if that's something that you see, or maybe see any kind of worth into the near future. And by that, I mean using these kinds of things, games in general, not just video games, which we were just talking about, but board games, not just as the digital tool. When you think of a video game, you see the screen and you maybe think of the computer, but when you have pen and paper in front of you, how is that also a good thing?
So it makes me think of two things. So one is understanding, like seeing serious games, like games that are in Games for Change. The games that we develop at the Games Lab are educational based, so they would be considered serious games. But there are also other games that talk about these social issues, that talk about social justice issues, and that's even coming into VR. One of the cool VR project I saw someone was working on, I can't remember specifically, but they were looking at a way of using VR, and this is with older, like with older youth and adults, but getting them to experience like microaggressions through a character, like through playing someone in virtual reality. And so they get to experience that sort of interaction. There's also been like another game that was on microaggressions. There have been games on immigration and refugee. And so there's this whole pocket of games that have been addressing different issues, or even bringing on different knowledges and centering different people's knowledges from an authentic way within that community. So, I mean, I would always say like point to Games for Change, because they've been doing that. They at least cite different works, and then just so there's this work in serious games that are doing that. And then the other piece that you're talking about is understanding design processes. So at the Games Lab, our director, Barbara Chamberlain, as well as Jesse Schell from the Schell Studios, have been working on a transformational design framework that looks at 3 different aspects of designing transformational games. So one is like, what is the change you want to make? Then the next step is identifying the activities that normally happen to make that change happen. And then just seeing what can a game do differently. And so those are the 3 steps I'm saying in a very simple way. And so what we've done is not as much of this past couple of years, because we've had our summer programs have been online with youth. with children and youth. But we, in the past, before the pandemic, we've been creating a toolkit that really models how do you support informal educators and even, formal educators, but primarily like 4-H agents, and walking them through the transformational design framework for students, because we've developed a series of activities that helps them think about through design process from our perspective of transformational design, but understanding how you can basically take a change, how you want to change a player, and then think about what does that look like in a game, and walking children and youth through steps. And a lot of that comes through playing different kinds of board games, playing different kinds of digital games, understanding rules in games, understanding, having a theme of a game, understanding a player's experience and what players are looking for, understanding what's important for them and things that, and getting them to reflect on their own experience and what they care about and what they would like to see change, and then translating that into what are some things that they can do, what happens in day-to-day life that creates that change. And then playing with, because they play with different games, different kinds of games, board games, card games, different things, they can begin to think about game mechanics and different ways that games are designed and played. And so then from that experience, then they're able to say, okay, here's a prototype of a game, how we want to pitch a game being made that's like this. So they don't necessarily design the game itself. That's kind of the next step. But they begin to understand that design is a process, that even coming up with the design idea is a process, that it takes a lot of creativity. It takes a lot of testing, troubleshooting, getting feedback from other people. Are you explaining something clearly or not? Have you thought about these different pieces? And so they begin to understand that design, that the transformational design process, because they go to our studio and they see, maybe they're testing usually a prototype or testing something. They understand that it's a team, that it's a process, that it takes a lot longer than they think it does. But those are the different pieces that for me are exciting to see. And that sometimes the frustrating part will be they're looking for a right answer. And I'll say, well, what do you think? What do your peers think? Let's try this. Has someone else done this in the game? Let's try something else. Like there is. And so that I always like when that wall begins to happen, where they realize that they are knowledge keepers and that they are creative, and that it's really about me helping to be, as I said before, a facilitator and like supporting that. But I have to really kind of strategically figure out, okay, who is this student? How are they learning? How are they processing information? Do I need to make any adjustments or tweaks to help support them so that they feel comfortable and they feel like they can take ownership of their ideas?
Yeah, I think my next question actually was like, given all the topics we've talked about today already, like, and then just to read some, like the wider definitions of texts, using them, the text to think critically, involving teachers, not just the students, right, in these conversations and efforts, and just what you talked about, like the whole design is a process thing. My question was essentially, what are the implications or the opportunities for future work along these topics that we talked about? I think you gave already beat me to the punch there a little bit with the answer, but I was wondering if you have, if you have anything else you think you might want to talk about, like what does all of this mean, you think, going forward into the next, maybe, I don't know, 10, 20 years or so? Any thoughts? What do you think?
I mean, there's so many different ways. I mean, even for my work, as you all even noted before, I do this work in so many different angles, whether I'm talking about it from a policy perspective, researcher, educator, designer. I think there's so many opportunities to really kind of investigate our own selves and how we're looking at media, how we're looking at creating media and seeing and just constantly finding ways to ask the questions in applicable ways that resonate for us. I mean, I feel like the work that I do, a lot of it, I end up producing it and writing about it because I also know if no one's out there talking about it, and I'm okay with making myself kind of the center of disagreement or agreement. Like I don't, for me, it's really about facilitating a conversation and really trying to get students, adults, everyone to be curious about technology, be curious about media, and not say to be curious about technology, to be curious about technology, but looking at it as a continuation of different tools out there that we should really look at and investigate and explore, and then wondering who's seen, who's not seen. How can we also support students in being critical users, critical creators, and also just having them feel like enough courage or enough like power within themselves that they can figure it out. Like, I feel like that's sometimes what I'm trying to support myself in doing, support students in doing, is feeling like they don't have to know the right answer. And I think like that also speaks to researchers, but you have enough confidence to figure it out. You know how to kind of think critically, you know how to think creatively, you know how to ask other people, you know how to use resources, like just to be able to figure out and sit in messiness, because we also don't know what's going to happen in the next we don't really know what's going to happen in the next 10 years. Like, we can project. And as we see, like as researchers, we're consistently looking at patterns and trying to project and trying to see things, but then we always can't define this specifically is going to happen at this particular time on this specific date. We can really use information and so also being information gatherers, being information producers, you know, seeing themselves as producers of content. That's sometimes what I work on, not just even from a student's perspective, but even from educators' perspective. Like, you have valuable knowledge. Like, how do I get us to collaborate and see ourselves as collaborators? So there's a lot of things going on to work on. It just kind of depends on the piece and starting where we are and then doing actionable items wherever we are in whatever way is meaningful for us.
That's a perfect introduction for our next salon, which is actually September 17th, like same place, same time, 1 p.m. in Arizona, 1 p.m. on the Pacific Coast. Timeline's weird, time zones are weird here, but we're going to talk about podcasting. So we're actually going to talk about having students or anyone become a producer of this media and have more of a voice. So please join us on September 17th, and we're going to pick up this topic. Louise, any final words?
No, just before we wrap up, I was wondering if Amanda, is there anything, Latasha, is there anything going on or looking forward to in the next year? Anything that you want to maybe update us on? Where can we kind of find out more about you? Things like that.
So, I mean, I have Amanda Latasha as my website. Amanda Latasha is also my Twitter handle, my IG handle. Amanda is my first name, Latasha is my middle name. And I go by Amanda Latasha or Amanda. Some interesting things if you want to stay abreast on what's happening with me from a designer perspective, I would say check out the blog that we've launched with Innovative Media Productions, is just where I'm talking about for the Learning Games Lab. We have a blog that centers on like 4-H extension agent resources, as well as design processes, and even just finding out even some of the products even that I'm talking about that I haven't referenced to specifically, but you can find out there. We are also doing some work at New America from a policy perspective on inclusive technology. So we have roundtables, we have information posted on there. We also have some information on culturally responsive teaching, and I'm working on some work there, a research brief on content related to that. And so I would say if you want things from a policy perspective, New America, and then I'll still be writing for Edutopia and Britannica for families to talk about in an applied context with families and educators. So, and if you have any questions about anything, feel free to, I have my contact information on my website, so you can reach out to me there and find me.
That all sounds wonderful. And we also have your contact info on the blog post at Talking About Design. And I think I want to thank you again for coming by and talking with us about all these wonderful things you're up to and the things you're thinking about. I really appreciate it. I want to thank, before we head off, I know Amanda Risky is kind of behind the scenes right now, monitoring YouTube and making sure the room is running nice. And Melissa as well, who also hopped on and was part of the conversation. Thanks to the Talking About Design group in general, which we keep the website updated as we keep on writing and talking about things. And as Melissa mentioned earlier, we have our next one coming up, I think in the month of September. I forgot the date already.
September 17th.
September 17th. We hope to see you all there again on the topic of podcasting.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you for your
everybody.
time and for allowing me to participate. It's been a great